Conflicts that Shaped Pharaonic Egypt. Lecture 6. The Belly of Stones, Reunification and the Fortresses of the Southern Frontier.
Following the end of internal turmoil during the reign of Amenemhat I, the 12th dynasty, the high point of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, becomes the time of the literary golden age. The Middle Egyptian stories, such as the eloquent peasant and the story of the wanderings of Sinuhe, become tales, especially Sinuhe, copied for centuries afterwards. At the same time, we find a set of proscribal writings, texts highlighting the benefits of a scribal training, the benefits of literacy, setting those up against the perceived horrors of almost any other undertaking. This appears to be part of a conscious effort on the part of the Middle Kingdom administration to recruit people for the increasingly enormous and elaborate bureaucracy of Middle Kingdom Egypt. We even see this at rock inscription sites out in the Western Desert. Now, suddenly, for the Middle Kingdom, not only is there a great rise in these inscriptions, the Middle Kingdom is in fact the golden age of rock art and rock inscriptions of the Pharaonic period as well. Not only do we see an increase in the number of inscriptions at rock art sites, but we also see an increase in the number of people who have at least some level of literacy. A number of inscriptions at rock art sites record simply the name and title of the person, and some of these people, such as at the Great Wadi al-Hol site in the middle of the Kenna Bend of the Nile, many of the people have no title other than garrison soldier, militiaman, etc. Some of these people don't seem to be able to write absolutely anything they wanted either. They can write their names. They may have had a certain passive recognition. This is something we should also remember for ancient Egypt. For us, questions of literacy tend to be all or nothing. Either someone can read and write or they cannot. For antiquity, especially for Egypt, with a relatively complicated writing system, both a hieroglyphic script and a cursive script that operates sometimes along somewhat different principles, levels of semi-literacy come into play. Be that as it may, Middle Kingdom Egypt certainly saw a great rise in literacy. Egypt during the Middle Kingdom is also a place of greater interaction between Egyptians and foreigners. No more the mercenary wars of the early Middle Kingdom. We now have all manner of foreigners from the greater Mediterranean world interacting with the ancient Egyptians. For the first time in the Middle Kingdom, we see evidence of more regular contact with the Aegean world, references to the Keftiu ships, the ships of Crete, that apparently plied the Mediterranean between the Nile Delta and their island home. The Egyptians continue their mining activities in Sinai that we see in operation already during the early Old Kingdom, and particularly at a site in south-central Sinai, Sirabit el-Khadem, the Egyptians establish an important temple to the goddess Hathor at the turquoise mines of Sirabit el-Khadem. From inscriptions at Sirabit, we see that Egyptian expeditions consisted not only of Egyptians, but also of Asiatics who accompanied the miners, and at least some of those Asiatics were armed. At least some appear to have provided armed escort for the mining expeditions. By the late Middle Kingdom in Sinai, at Sirabit el-Khadem predominantly, but at a few other places as well, we begin to see the evidence for a new writing system, employing signs derived from the Egyptian scripts, but with phonetic values not known for the Egyptians. These inscriptions, often called Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, are better termed early alphabetic. They write a Semitic language using Egyptian signs with phonetic values derived from the Semitic name for the object that Egyptian sign represents. So, for instance, in order to write the phoneme R, one would draw the sign of a head derived from the Egyptian script, a human head, the name for that in the apparently Northwest Semitic language the inscriptions wrote being something on the order of Ras. So acrophonically, the first consonantal phoneme of the word describing the sign is used to give the alphabetic value. These early alphabetic inscriptions stand as the earliest examples in a direct line of development that leads ultimately to Western alphabetic scripts, including, of course, the Greek and Latin alphabets. The earliest examples of this alphabetic script, however, are not from Sinai, but are from the western desert of Egypt, from the Wadi al-Hol in the Kenna Bend of the Nile. Those inscriptions are derived not from hieroglyphic originals, but from cursive Egyptian signs. That means that we can paleographically date the time when those alphabetic signs left the living Egyptian tradition. Cursive scripts are always more easily dated within a shorter period of time than the non-cursive. This is especially true for the cursive hieratic Egyptian when compared to the hieroglyphic script. The Wadi al-Hol alphabetic inscriptions in the Egyptian Western Desert date almost certainly to the reign of Amenemhat III in the late 12th dynasty, but show an origin of the script coming out of the living Egyptian cursive hieratic tradition already during the time of the early Middle Kingdom, already probably 100 years or more before that mass of early alphabetic inscriptions at Sarabat al-Khadim and at other points in the Sinai. The interaction of the ancient Egyptians with Nubians in the south, Asiatics in the northeast, and visiting Aegeans and others is producing an increasingly international society. Out of these interactions within the Egyptian sphere of influence comes the origin of the proto-alphabet, the first alphabetic script writing Semitic languages. Technically speaking, we should not call these alphabets, since an alphabet, as its name implies, writes both vowels and consonants. In the Hamito-Semitic languages, Egypt being the oldest known amongst them, voweling is somewhat less important in the graphic written system, and only consonantal sounds are written. So technically speaking, this early system is not alphabetic, but actually should be termed an abgad. Egypt is certainly interested in activities in Syria-Palestine, and we have increasing evidence for military razzias into the area, some sorts of military raids alongside normal trade relations. We see trade relations with the wider Aegean world and with Nubia, but in Nubia things are a little different. Only in Nubia do we see real imperial expansion on the part of Middle Kingdom Egypt. And this is not difficult to understand. Nubia was not only important to the ancient Egyptians as the source of those great mercenaries for the armies of the Upper Egyptian governors in the First Intermediate period, Nubia is also the source of many things Egypt needed. First and foremost of these being gold. Through her Nilotic and desert routes, Nubia was also Egypt's primary link with a number of long-distance trade routes, leading even into the Sahel and points beyond. From these areas came a number of valuable products, not the least important of which, and this is important for us to understand, not the least important of which were those essential to the functioning of religious cults in Egypt. Articles such as leopard pelts and ostrich feathers that we might consider oddities or luxury goods were essential for the priestly costume of the Sem priest, for fans and official costumes of other sorts. Much of the myrrh and incense burned almost continuously in the divine sanctuaries of Egypt would have come along caravan routes, many of which passed through Nubia. Much of what we would consider to be something without which one could make do if necessary is something that would have brought an absolute look of horror to the face of an ancient Egyptian. Products important for the cult were equally important with products of great economic significance. Egypt and Nubia also appear to have enjoyed or suffered from a natural antagonism that is probably born of their close cultural and religious ties and their essentially common origin out of the North African Neolithic. Already during the Old Kingdom, Egypt maintained some sort of outpost near the second cataract of the Nile, near Buhan. The Nile cataracts are granitic barriers across which the Nile flows. These barriers create dangerous rapids, changes in current strength, and are deadly to the hulls of ships. The Nile was not formerly at a constant level. Its level rose and fell during the course of the year. During low Nile, much of the Nile would have been impassable to vessels, especially the cataracts. During high Nile, those rocks creating the rapids might be dangerously hidden, just out of view of the human eye, but well within reach of a vessel's hull. The cataracts were barriers to direct Nile traffic. Desert roads could very well cut off these cataracts, allow a caravan to avoid them, but any shipping going on would have to pass across them, perhaps even be carried around them. We actually have the evidence of one of these slipways near the fortress of Mirgissa around the second cataract, where boats were taken out and hauled along a slick mud track. Following apparent depopulation during the late Old Kingdom and the influx of the Sea Group people we discussed during the First Intermediate period and the early Middle Kingdom, Egypt becomes interested again in establishing a permanent presence and a permanent point of control in Nubia. The site they choose for a great system of fortresses is the area of the Second Cataract, primarily the area just north and the area within the Second Cataract proper. These fortresses are constructed during the 12th dynasty, beginning primarily during the reign of Sesostris I, and they remain the physical basis for many of the later New Kingdom Egyptian policies in northern Nubia. In order to understand the Nubian strategies of later Egyptian rulers, one must understand the Middle Kingdom fortification system in Nubia and understand how the conflicts between the Egyptians and Nubians during the late Middle Kingdom and the Second Intermediate period influenced later actions. Although their imposing and massive mud brick walls were among the earliest and most impressive large-scale fortifications surviving from antiquity, most of the remains of the enormous Egyptian fortress system in Nubia are now buried beneath the waters of the lake behind the successive Aswan dams. Fortunately, thanks to rescue archaeology throughout the first quarter of the 20th century and again in the 1960s, we know a great deal about these fortifications. Although Mentuhotep II and Amenemhat I campaigned in Nubia, it was the son and successor of Amenemhat I, Sesostris I, between about 1956 and 1911 BCE, who established a major chain of fortresses between Aswan and the Second Cataract in Nubia. Sesostris I constructed at least 5 fortifications north of the Second Cataract, each located with a different strategic purpose in mind. The northernmost of these fortresses were the twin fortifications of Ekur and Kuban that guarded from both sides of the Nile River the terminus of the roads leading into the Wadi Alaki gold mining region of the Eastern Desert. The fortress at Aniba, approximately halfway between the Ekur-Kuban group and the great fortress of Buhan, guarded a relatively fertile agricultural region that was home to a number of native Nubian Sea Group settlements. The southernmost pair of Sesostris I's Nubian fortifications were the great fortress of Buhan and the fortress of Kor. In spite of the different motivations for the locations of each of these fortresses, and in spite of the different functions each may have carried out, all of Sesostris I's Nubian fortifications possessed a similar rectangular ground plan, with one side of the fort abutting the Nile River and a single main gateway oriented towards the desert. The most elaborate and well-known of the fortifications in Sesostris I's fortress system was the fortress of Buhan. The earliest version of the Buhan fortress consisted of a central fort approximately 150 by 138 meters in size, containing all administrative, economic, and residential buildings of the fortification. Surrounding this core defense was a daunting and relatively complex outer defensive system. The mud brick walls, nearly 5 meters thick at their base, and originally more than 9 meters in height, had reinforcing wooden beams and reed matting in order that these massive walls not be entirely brittle, so that the bricks could absorb possible seismic activity and any sort of ramming attack by an enemy. The base of the wall had a parapet punctuated with round towers, each tower with multiple loopholes. This outer lower parapet overlooked a ditch or a dry moat approximately 7 meters wide and 3 meters deep. Opposite the parapet, on the other side of the moat, was a counter-scarp. An outer defensive wall, reinforced by small round towers, enclosed a greater area of approximately 420 by 150 meters. The location of the early Middle Kingdom fortresses on open ground would have made them vulnerable ultimately to a long-term siege by any technologically sophisticated opponent. But such apparently did not exist in Nubia at the time when Sesostris I planned his first great complex of early 12th dynasty fortifications. Each of Sesostris I's forts may be termed a plains-style fort. Each fortress is located in relatively flat terrain. This apparently means that these forts were intended to defend against a massed infantry attack, an attack that must see those mounting it run across a broad, open field, dodging arrows and projectiles, and ultimately fail in the rain of arrows the defenders would pour on them through the loopholes in the elaborate central fortification system. These fortresses invite someone to attack them along the flat ground, invite those people to jump over the counterscarp, pour down into the dry moat, and have to take the outer system before they can take the inner system. These fortresses guard against massed infantry attack and serve as campaign bases for conflicts fought further to the south or deeper in the surrounding deserts. The fortifications were interconnected by smaller observation towers and by a system of roads and tracks. These are not forts to guard the Nile, The Nile needs little guarding at this point, just between the first and the second cataract. These are fortifications, they're backs to the Nile for permanent water that provide bases in foreign territory for mobile Egyptian military units. The fortresses not only served as stunning, massive architectural expressions of Egypt's domination over Lower Nubia, they also carried out economic functions, facilitating the storage and transportation of raw materials, particularly gold. Inscriptions from the amethyst quarry in the Wadi al-Hudi suggest that Sesostris I's fortress construction was paralleled by economic integration of the Nubian population. Just as Mentuhotep II said he wanted the Western Desert Oases and the Lower Nubians to begin paying taxes like good tax-paying Egyptians, an inscription from the time of Sesostris I in the Wadi al-Hudi addresses local Nubians and tells them what they need to do if they want to become good Egyptians. These fortresses possessed also their own granaries and treasuries, which could supply military expeditions and provide a basis for local trade. Near the end of the 12th dynasty, matters change in Nubia, and Sesostris III, 1870 to 1831 BCE, made extensive alterations to some of the earlier forts and constructed an entirely new series of fortifications, apparently attempting to adapt both Egyptian policy and Egyptian military architecture to some evolving threat in the south. The fortress plans of the late Middle Kingdom are not primarily rectilinear shapes, and these fortresses do not occupy flat areas. They do not conform to the plain-style fortifications of Sesostris I. The fortress plans of the late Middle Kingdom occupy rocky hilltops. These forts conform in shape not to a military designer's plan, but to the topography of the rocky surfaces atop which they perch. These forts are not between the first cataract and the second cataract. They are not really in the northern part of the second cataract. They are actually within the rocky second cataract itself, in an area more recently known in Arabic as the Batn al-Hajar, or the belly of stones. The fortress of Buhen already guarded the northern portion of the Batn al-Hajar. During the reign of Sesostris III, the outer wall of Buhen was rebuilt, with defenses mirroring those of the inner fort, a wall with continuous parapet and rectangular towers overlooking a ditch and a counterscarp. Additional barracks are added, etc. Sesostris III also apparently enlarged the fortress of Kor. The late Middle Kingdom Egyptians also altered the entire fortification system, not simply in terms of the physical architecture. Sesostris III commissioned hilltop fortresses within the Batn al-Hajar at Mirgissa, Shalfaq, Uranarti, and Askut. Each of these fortresses possesses a unique ground plan which fits the contours of the rocky hilltops they occupy. They also incorporate a new architectural element, a type of projecting wall. Projecting towers and spur walls provide access for the defenders to high areas and higher outcrops near the fortress, without requiring those areas to be enclosed in larger walls. At the same time, these projections and these spur walls extending out from the main fortification allowed the defenders to be able to shoot down on people approaching the entranceways. A unit of 3 fortresses guarded the southernmost point of Egyptian control at the far southern end of the Batn al-Hajar, the triple fortress group of Simna, Kuma, and Simna South. Simna, the largest of the complex, had an L-shaped ground plan, approximately 130 meters on each long side. Bastions project from the main wall. Surrounding the ditch is a counterscarp with a glacis. Simna South had a particularly secure access to water, a subterranean staircase running beneath the outer works. Why would the Egyptians alter their fortifications in the Second Cataract so extensively? More specifically, why would Sesostris III change completely the shape and layout of the fortresses and site them almost exclusively atop rather steep, rocky outcroppings within the belly of stones itself? These fortresses do not guard the Second Cataract. Shipping really could not pass through the Second Cataract very easily. To position a fort in the Second Cataract, in fact, assures almost that it will not be attacked from the river side. These fortresses could function as isolated units, but more importantly, by the end of the reign of Sesostris III, they were a great integrated whole, forming part of a great defensive system. Within this mud brick curtain along the Second Cataract, some forts carried out specific roles. The island fortress of Askut possessed enough granaries and storerooms. It's virtually filled inside with granaries and storerooms. It possessed enough to provision the garrisons of nearly all the other Second Cataract forts, and would have been ideal as a fortified grain depot for military expeditions into hostile Nubian territory. Mirgissa, at the northern end of the Batn al-Hajar, appears to have been the focus of trade between Egypt and Nubia. Watchtowers, desert outposts, patrol routes continued to interconnect the older Sesostris I plains forts with the new hilltop fortifications of the Batn al-Hajar under Sesostris III. The intervisibility of the fortresses and the smaller outposts indicates that visual signals were somehow communicated between the different components of the fortress system. We know from a unique set of military dispatches from the fortress of Simna, copied in ancient Thebes, that military patrols from the fortifications, these patrols composed perhaps primarily of Nubian auxiliaries of the ancient Egyptians, military patrols recorded the movements of even small groups of local Nubians, demonstrating both the effectiveness and the frightening amount of oversight of the Egyptian patrols during the late 12th dynasty. Between the reigns of Sesostris I and Sesostris III, we see the rise of a new Nubian political entity centered near the Third Cataract, an entity that would soon develop into what we call the Kingdom of Kerma. This increasingly centralized and expanding state just south of the Egyptian border appears to have provided the impetus for the new style of fortification in Nubia under Sesostris III. Sesostris III's border defense system certainly succeeded in keeping the Kerma threat at bay through the end of the Middle Kingdom, nearly a century later. Interestingly, in the third phase of life for most of these Egyptian fortresses in Nubia, a phase that began with the reconquest of Lower Nubia at the end of the 17th dynasty, the fortification systems are altered yet again. Although New Kingdom Buhan was imposing and a functional fortification, it did not any longer possess the elaborate outer works and this elaborate loophole system of the Middle Kingdom fortress. Apparently, for New Kingdom Buhan, an appearance of power is much more important as an architectural manifestation than a well-designed means of making that power manifest. What does this tell us about Egyptian fortification design? The Egyptian fortifications in Nubia reveal an evolving Egyptian approach to an evolving Nubian threat. The early fortresses are for guarding against an enemy who might mass large numbers of soldiers, but who could wield little sophisticated attack ability against a fortification. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, however, some enemy, probably Kerma, we know to be rising in power in the area of the Third Cataract, some enemy is able to threaten those fortifications. Apparently, that enemy has the capability of attacking directly a fortification. And for that reason, Sesostris III extends the Egyptian Second Cataract group of forts into the Batn al-Hajar itself in order to situate his fortifications atop rocky promontories so that sapping of the walls becomes a virtual impossibility. The only way to attack those forts is to scale these sometimes almost vertical rocky hillsides and attack the fort under enfilading fire of the defenders from these great spur walls. By the time of the New Kingdom, all those elaborate outer defenses are considered useless. Nubia, in the time of the New Kingdom, consists of a sequence of integrated client states. These are now bases for the Egyptians in friendly territory, not outposts in enemy territory. At the same time the great Nubian fortresses were functioning, we know that along the eastern delta, something called the Wall of the Ruler was functioning, apparently another system of watchtowers and patrol roads. And from the remains of at least one fortified temple construction in the Wadi Natrun, southwest of the western edge of the delta, a series of Libyan desert fortifications probably also functioned during the Middle Kingdom. The late Middle Kingdom is something different from what comes before. Cultural and political changes appear in the middle of the 12th dynasty, and the major break comes in the reign of Sesostris III. The changes that appear in the late Middle Kingdom, with the greater centralization of titles, the greater specificity of administrative titles, changes in the typology and contents of stele and private inscriptions, the falling out of use of regional differences in pottery styles, the adoption of a more generic late Middle Kingdom style of ceramic production throughout Egypt, all of this appears to represent a desire for greater regulation and more precise control. We see this nowhere better than in the terrifyingly efficient records of the great prison of Thebes, preserved in a papyrus now in the Brooklyn Museum that records how the state was able to track various fugitives, those who hadn't paid their taxes, etc., how they were able to find some of those people, how they were able to take certain family members hostage for the return or good faith of others. Late Middle Kingdom Egypt, late 12th dynasty Egypt, during the reign of Amenemhat III, becomes a truly frighteningly well-organized and functioning administrative machine. It is all that more surprising, then, that this machine flies apart, falls to pieces during the 13th dynasty. The collapse of the Middle Kingdom, the wars of the Second Intermediate Period, and the foundation of imperial Egypt will form the basis of the next lecture.